What comes into your head when you think about the Porsche 911?
Don't let your kids watch it!
The reason why I ask this question to people from different backgrounds is that they have different views about it. The Porsche 911 is one of those cars that has crossed the barrier of only being known by car enthusiasts or petrolheads and crossed into the mainstream. Top Gear, on their list of the 50th most iconic cars of the past 20 years, lists a version of the 911 on spot 42, sandwiched between the Boxster and the Porsche Carrera GT. The 911 has appeared as a pop culture icon alongside movie stars such as Steve McQueen, Margot Robbie, Robert Redford, Jeff Bridges or Charlie Sheen. It has also appeared as a menacing presence in movies such as Condorman or in anime as the famous Blackbird from Wong at Midnight. In Kuramulu, we're able to find examples of several generations of this car, but I will dedicate this video into one particular model, the 996. This 996. Keep it in mind as it will have a huge importance later down in the video. However, despite existing for over 60 years, the car, as well as Porsche itself, is a divisive brand. On the one hand, the cars are praised.
And I bought it because I thought it was pretty. If I only could have one sports car, it would be a Speedster.
And in the other, they are called out for their laziness and stolen identity.
I'm going slowly and it feels just like all Porsche 911s, which means it feels just like a Volkswagen Beetle.
So, before we jump into the car itself, let's establish some foundations about Porsche itself. The year is 1962. The first adventure of James Bond, Dr. No, premiered on the silver screen. The Cold War was warming up on America's doorstep, Tom Cruise had just been born, and Graham Hill became Formula One champion for the first time in his career. By 1962, Porsche had already established itself as a luxury brand with a strong racing program. However, something was missing. The old but venerable 356 still sold well, but with its technology hitting a limit to which no possible upgrade could perfect it, combined with the aging design for the swinging 60s, Porsche sought to find a suitable replacement. Enter Ferdinand Alexander Porsche, the eldest son of the incumbent Porsche boss Ferry Porsche. Known by his friends as Butzi, he studied industrial design in Ulm, Germany, and after his talent was dismissed by the examination board, he decided to take some practical experience in the body design workshop of Erwin Comenda's car company, who used VW parts. In the early 60s, he was summoned back to Porsche HQ to work on what Ferry Porsche dubbed the 901 prototype. Ferry wanted the new car to be the continuation of the 356, but it should have more space and comfort in the cabin, as well as a larger trunk when compared to its previous model. It is important to highlight that this didn't mean that the new Porsche was going to be a family car, but to be a more practical use, a car that could be both great casual drive as well as to allow the driver to have its fancy. As it had been Porsche's tradition, the engine would be fit in the rear, but with a major difference. This time, it would be a 6-cylinder Boxster engine that produced 168 horsepower at 5,800 RPM. With a dry weight of 1,020 kilograms, the new Porsche was both light and powerful enough to cut corners faster than its predecessor. Along with this, keeping the engine in the rear position aided traction with different types of terrain, something that would come in handy to the performance of the car in motorsports, which Porsche had competed since the early 50s. But the biggest contribution to the new car came from Butzi, whose initial design for the 901 was accepted into becoming the final shape for the car. Sporting a low-profile design, the tail shaped like an airplane wing, and a flat bottom and bonnet, the new Porsche could cut through the wind as well as stick itself to the ground as best as possible. However, amongst the several people that were involved in the development of the car, part of the design of the 901 was attributed to Helmut Bott, who designed alongside Peter Falk the suspension system of the car. While its rear suspension would maintain the transversely mounted torsion bar system that was introduced by Ferdinand Porsche for the 356, the front end employed McPherson struts with longitudinally mounted torsion bars and an anti-roll bar. This system would stay in the car until the 964 generation in 1988 and would give the 911 one of its characteristic driving quirks. Because the engine was mounted in the rear axle, early 911s had substantial oversteer in hard corners at speeds in comparison to other sports cars of its time. Because most of the weight was in the rear, it caused 901s to have an understeer at low speeds. As time went on, and the drivers got accustomed to the cars, Porsche improved the system and the car was slowly refined into the sports car we know. On the 12th of September 1963, the car was introduced in the 41st Frankfurt Car Show and immediately grabbed the attention of the many present. The striking car even got the attention of Peugeot, who immediately threatened Porsche regarding the designation of the car. As its standard, Peugeot detained the patent rights to the designation 0 in the serial number. To avoid potential fights with the automotive giant, Porsche decided to rename the car into the 911, along with, just in case, holding the copyright to any car with the serial number 1 in the middle. To say that the Porsche 911 is one of the most famous sports cars of the 20th century is an understatement. Throughout its 60-year history, the Porsche 911 has had more incarnations than most other brands. It outlived pretty much all of the models that came before and since throughout its 7 generations. Each Porsche fan has its favorites. Some prefer the simplistic no-nonsense mechanics of the originals that evolved through several models such as the 911S, the 911 Targa, which was specifically created with the American convertible safety band in the mid-60s, which was never enforced. Perhaps the most famous and the culmination of the 911's early design was the 911 Carrera RS 2.7 of 1973, of which only 1,525 units were ever sold, created for the European GT Championship. Others prefer the turbo revolution ushered by the 1974 update to the original, the 930 variant, which introduced the Porsche 911 Turbo 3.3. Some might even prefer the power and elegance of the 964 and the 993, the last 911s to be sold with the air-cooled engines. Of course, regardless of which generation you like more, what was undeniable is that the Porsche 911 and the brand from Stuttgart were winning everything that was worth to be won throughout the 1970s and the 1990s. Curiously enough, the Porsche 911's career started prematurely in the 1965 Rally of Monte Carlo, where it placed 5th overall. While a small thing compared to what the 911 would go on to be, it was an early sign that the 911 could be competitive in any kind of sport you threw him in. Its mechanics made it endlessly tunable and powerful. 911s would also go on to dominate the Trans Am series under 2-liter class in the 1960s, winning the championships from 1967 to 1969. They would also later win 1973, 1974, and 1980. In Europe, the 911 would also win several other sport classes. An RSR version of the car would go on to win the Targa Florio, the Daytona and Sebring endurance races in the mid-70s. All of this would culminate in the Porsche 935, a modified version of the car, which would win the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1979. In parallel to this, Porsche would also grace victory lane with other models, such as the 917K and the 962. Because of the Porsche 911 was a car that most private teams could potentially own, several privateers acquired the car and would compete in races. Such notable teams affiliated in some way with Porsche were Martini Racing, Penske, Kremer Racing, Jodlos, Joest Racing, and Rothmans Porsche. Aside from endurance and road races, 911 will also be competitive in the Paris-Dakar Rally from 1984 to 1986.
And the battle is on in earnest between Porsche and Range Rover on the way to Dakar.
By the 1990s, Porsche had affirmed its place among the greatest car makers. However, going into this era, the company would face the greatest challenge. As the next generation of the 911 approached, serious doubts began to loom the future of Porsche.
Good evening. Today is Black Monday, the day the Dow dropped more than 500 points.
The 996 has often been labeled as the Black Duck by some Porsche fans, as it was the first 911 to be developed with a water-cooled engine as opposed to an air-cooled engine like its predecessors. This was seen by some as a sign that Porsche was shifting from the handcrafted feel of its cars, which were seen as precision machines with sense of individuality, towards mainstream machines for the masses. Some have since suggested that this change in the design of the 911 was due to the appointment of Ferdinand Piëch to be the head of the Volkswagen Group by 1993. As explained previously, he was heavily involved in the development of the 911, particularly in regards to how the engine could withstand strain in the racetrack. He was also heavily involved with Porsche's racing department, being one of the key figures in the development of the legendary 917. However, his stint at Porsche didn't last long, as he was fired and moved on to consulting work for other brands. This came from an agreement that no descendant of Ferdinand Porsche should be directly involved with the brand's daily operations. One of these consulting works was with Mercedes-Benz, where he was tasked with giving a bit more life and power to their diesel output. In fact, a great part of Piëch's legacy rests on two pillars: making waves on the development and evolution of the TDI technology, and trickling down the new technology that was introduced in more luxurious cars of the group to the more affordable, a strategy that contributed to the domineering dynasty that VW set in the 2000s. As a result, and after decades of successes in Audi, Piëch took over the reins of the entire VW group in 1993. Now in charge of a group that encompassed brands such as Volkswagen, Audi, Skoda, Bugatti and later Bentley, Piëch had now Porsche in his sights.
Und ich habe die Absicht, mit unseren Partnern, die VW in der ganzen Welt hat, der Sieger zu sein.
The first task was to raise the brand back from the dire straits it had been since the early 90s. For this, a modernization of the Zuffenhausen manufacturing facility was required to bring the plant to a competitive standard for the coming century. Along with this, cost-cutting measures were necessary, as well as the need to share parts between models. Putting aside production numbers and the gradual incorporation of water-cooled systems, the new 911 would share 38% of its parts with the upcoming Boxster, as well as a redesigned front end, which has since been dubbed the fried egg. With all these changes, the 996 was a complete departure from what came before, despite keeping true to the core principles set in 1963, a sports car without pretenses. Therefore, in my eyes, I see it as a bridge between the old and the new. The 911 you are seeing at the moment isn't any ordinary 911. This 996 has been a part of my family since 2006, steadily maintained by my father as the car he always wanted to have since childhood. Therefore, I've always wanted to make a video on the Porsche 911, but particularly on the 996. So, while researching for this video, I asked my dad the same question I asked to a lot of people in the beginning of this video. What comes into your head when you think about the Porsche 911? To my surprise, he had a completely different response than everyone else. But it was this response that finally made me realize why the 911 is so special. And the answer laid in plain sight. The Porsche 911 has three things that seem so elemental yet integral to its success. The first thing, and one we've already established earlier, the shape. When Buzzi designed the original 911, no one, not even him, anticipated that all 911s would follow the same design principle throughout the years. The side profile look is one of the most iconic parts of the 911, making it immediately recognizable, As such, and with the wish of Porsche to remain an independent car maker within the VW group, the development of the 996 had to be shared with the 986 Boxster in order to save costs. The result of this choice was that both cars ended up sharing many parts between one another, but the main airplane wing shape was kept in the 911. Zuffenhausen Legai, once an understudy of the 928's design, along with Pink Lai, managed to retain the 911's basic appearance while changing the car both externally and internally.
In short, the new car has to look like a 911. It has to look good and new. Even a young child or an old man, they can tell it is the new 911.
However, despite their contribution to the future design of the Porsche 911, the front end of the 996 is still object of ridicule from a lot of Porsche enthusiasts. The so-called fried egg headlamps incorporated into the front of the car was a design that was unseen before and that wouldn't be replicated again in the future. However, and in my own personal opinion, considering the design trends of the 90s and 2000s, I believe they created a car that stands out and sets some trends in Porsche's design, particularly the rear, which 21st century 911s would evolve from. Next is the quadrant dial. While Porsche's interior design for the 911 has changed a bit with the move to digital instrumentation in the late 2010s, this instrument cluster design was kept throughout. In its center, Porsche placed the rev counter, and all other dials are surrounding it. While some sports cars like McLaren and Ferrari have this type of display, it's a distinctive element of the 911's identity, a connection that harked back to the 356 and that focused on the idea to give the most important information to a driver. To Porsche, revolutions per minute is the most important information a 911 driver needs, whether he is driving on a Sunday or in a racetrack. Like the navigators of the 15th century who needed an astrolabe to see their way through the uncharted seas, Porsche racing drivers' best friend on a racetrack still is the rev counter. And finally, we have the startup sequence of a 911. I'll give you the example of this car, a Citroën C3. Usually you sit in it, key to the starter, turn it with your right hand, foot on the clutch, set it to neutral with your right hand again, and then start it with your right hand. In a 911, you sit in the car, key to the starter with your left hand, turn it, foot on the clutch, set it to neutral with your right hand, start it with your left hand, get into gear and drive off. While this seems more complex, your whole body is coordinating together to start it, almost like priming a machine or a computer. But why, you may ask? Well, it harkens back to the 550 Spider and the Le Mans running start. Throughout most of the history of the 24 Hours of Le Mans, drivers would await for the marshal to signal the start of the race. Once that happened, they would sprint into their cars as fast as possible in order to get them off the line. All Porsches since the 356 have this as a connection, and the 550 in specific was a Spider, meaning all the driver had to do was to jump on it and start it. While nowadays, this startup isn't as used as much with the switch to electronic ignition and startup buttons, the 911's unique starting up operation is one of the key icons of the car's identity. The 996 was a turning point for Porsche. It gained reputation as the 911 that deviated from the design of its predecessors. But deviating was necessary for the car to stand out. As a result, this generation of the 911 was the first one to surpass the 100,000 units sold since the iconic 930. And then there is the engine. Well, you can't see much from here, so let me show you another perspective. Due to both sharing the development, as mentioned previously, the 996 and the Boxer have a very similar engine. Of course, the engine of the 911 was kept in its classic displacement and bored out to 3.4 liters. As a result, the new 911 996 was powered by a brand new water-cooled flat-six Boxer engine developing 300 horsepower, a first for Porsche.
It's in here somewhere, behind this old washing machine.
Like previous 911s, the 996 was available with two-wheel drive and four-wheel drive, thus creating various different versions of the car such as the 911 Carrera, the 911 Carrera 4, and after a power boost to 320 horsepower, the 911 Carrera 4S. What was undeniable is that the new 911 handles as good as its forebears, and this was reflected by several reviews and the press of its day. In 1997, Tiff Needell, during his time as presenter of All Top Gear, road tested the 996. He praised the car for its aggressive look, grown-up design for the late 90s, the spaciousness in the interior, apart from the back, and that the brakes were really good.
It just stops.
But Needell also pointed out that while the car was still as good to drive as its predecessors, was nowhere near as aggressive as any of them. But the story of the 911-996 doesn't stop here. It got several different Carrera versions, and most importantly, two iconic cars. The first was the 911 Turbo, released in 2001. Like the Carrera 4S, the new Turbo was equipped with four-wheel drive system and developed 415 horsepower. With a top speed of close to 306 km an hour, it was one of the fastest production cars of its time. It was equally legendary both in real life.
So you spun it then?
I spun it slightly.
What do you mean slightly?
And in video games, as it was featured in Need for Speed Porsche Unleashed as the cover car. And the top spec of the 996 was the 911 GT3, which dispenses any introductions. It was a homologation special, built specifically to legalize the car for racing in a production car category, just like the 911 Carrera RS from 1973. It was powered by a normally aspirated 3.6-liter engine, producing 381 horsepower, and it was enough to match the turbo. However, I can't do justice to the 911 GT3, so I'll leave that task for Richard Hammond.
This is an amazing machine. You can put it where you want it and then hold it in huge slides.
As for my own experience driving it, the 996 is a car that symbolizes one term for me: the Swiss Army knife. The 996 is a car that handles great, keeps you stuck to your seat in tension, and it is a car that you can share stories with other owners. It is also a Porsche that, despite its various problems, including and not limited to the IMS, still is valuable to both me and others. Unfortunately, because this car was designed to be a platform for the next 10 years, it is obviously an inception car. It is a car that can be good at everything you throw at it: hill climb, rally, racetrack, or road trip. But it won't excel in everything. It's an average student with boundless potential. Boundless potential, that is, that would be unlocked in its subsequent generations. Having said this is still my favorite generation of the 911. I love its timeless looks, its grunt, its handling. But above all else, it's a car that connects me with my past and my memories, and therefore, no matter how many times I hear there are better Porsches out there, this will always be my Porsche. Today, the VW Group is in a strange situation. While more favorable than the financial woes of the 90s, the company has since laid out several of its workers in its German plants. The current generation of the 911, the 992, is still selling strong as the car marches on through the 2020s. No signs of stopping, at least for the foreseeable future. What is clear is that emission regulations and climatic concerns have put pressure on car makers to incorporate electrification into their car ranges. And while the Volkswagen Group seems to be following this trend as well, most drivers don't appreciate the sudden shift. Porsche themselves have yet to confirm if the 911 will be fully electrified, but reading between the lines, a Porsche 911 with batteries and an electric engine might not be in the cards. As such, unless confirmed otherwise, the Porsche 911 will continue to roam the roads with an engine powered by fossil fuels or as a hybrid. In many ways, even back in the late 90s, the Porsche 911-996 was already a sign of things to come. We can all have our different opinions regarding if the design and the engine were the right calls. But what is undeniable is the 996 succeeded in bringing the 911 to the 21st century. A farewell for the true analogic 911. It might have started life as the oddity, but now it's a well-respected car and a sign of better times. For me, it will always be my Porsche. It did not need to be the fastest, the most powerful, or the most influential, but it was the car that appeared in the right place, in the right time. Truly, lightning in a bottle.